Welcome to HOA Boardroom Battles. This is what selective enforcement looks like. I work as an auto body shop estimator in Boston, which means I spend my days documenting damage and writing quotes for insurance companies. I am good at noticing details. I moved to the Towline Oaks Reserve Association neighborhood 6 months ago because the mortgage rate was decent and the commute was manageable. The HOA seemed normal at first. Standard rules about lawn height and trash cans. Then my brother flew in from Denver for a long weekend, rented a car at Logan and parked it in the guest spot outside my unit. That was a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, there was a chalk mark on his rear tire and a woman in a blue blazer standing in my driveway, holding a megaphone like she was about to announce a hostage situation. Her name was Laura Hayes. She was the pool and amenities chair, which in most neighborhoods means you unlock the clubhouse and order chlorine. In Towline Oaks, it meant she controlled access to everything like a bouncer at a nightclub, and she had decided my brother's car was a violation. She did not knock. She just stood there with the megaphone pressed to her lips and her free hand clutching a coffee cup so hard I could see it shaking. I opened the door and she lowered the megaphone just enough to speak without amplification, but her voice was still too loud for 7 in the morning. "You cannot park overnight in guest parking," she said. "That vehicle has been there since yesterday. I have photographic evidence and a chalk mark proving non-movement. You need to move it immediately or I am calling the tow company." I blinked at her. My brother was still asleep. I had not even finished my first cup of coffee. I told her the car belonged to my guest and that he was visiting for the weekend. She shook her head and pulled a laminated card from her blazer pocket, the kind you might use for a restaurant menu or a hall pass. She held it up between us like a shield. "Guest parking is limited to 4 hours during the day and prohibited entirely between midnight and 6 in the morning," she said. "I do not care what you think. I care what the rule says. Your guest violated the rule. The vehicle will be towed if it is not moved within 30 minutes. I asked her where that rule was posted. She pointed at a sign near the mailboxes, but I had walked past that sign 100 times and never seen anything about overnight guest parking. I told her I would move the car as soon as my brother woke up, but that I needed more than 30 minutes. She sipped her coffee and smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes. 30 minutes, she repeated. After that, I am authorizing the tow. And if you want to argue about it, I can put you on the agenda and keep you there." She turned and walked back toward the clubhouse, her blue baseball cap catching the morning light. I stood there holding my own coffee cup watching her go, and I realized 2 things. First, she was wearing a tiny body camera clipped to her blazer collar. Second, she had just threatened me with a board agenda like it was a prison sentence. I went back inside, woke my brother, and told him to move his car to the street. He groaned and asked why. I said because the HOA had a towing fetish and I was trying to refinance my mortgage, which meant I could not afford to have any lien threats or legal noise in my file. He moved the car. I thought that was the end of it. By that afternoon, there was a new notice taped to every mailbox in the complex. It was printed on bright yellow paper, entitled "Guest Parking Compliance Reminder" in bold letters. The notice announced that starting immediately, all guest vehicles would be required to display a temporary permit decal obtained from the management office during business hours. Any guest vehicle without a decal would be subject to immediate towing at the owner's expense. There was no mention of the 4-hour rule Laura had cited that morning. There was no mention of overnight restrictions. It was a completely different rule, printed and distributed within hours of my brother moving his car. I pulled the notice off my mailbox and read it twice. The management office was only open Monday through Friday, 9 to 4. My brother was leaving Sunday morning. Even if I wanted to get a decal, I could not. I called the management number listed at the bottom of the notice and got a voicemail. I left a message asking how to comply with a rule that required office access on a weekend. No one called me back. That evening, my brother parked on the street in front of my unit. The street was public property, maintained by the city, and there were no HOA rules about street parking because the HOA did not own the street. I thought that would solve the problem. I was wrong. At 6 in the morning on Saturday, I woke up to the sound of a diesel engine idling outside. I looked out the window and saw a flatbed tow truck backed up to my brother's rental car. A man in a high-visibility vest was hooking chains to the front axle. Laura Hayes was standing on the sidewalk with her clipboard, her body camera recording, and her megaphone resting against her hip like a sword. I ran outside in my socks and a t-shirt. I shouted at the tow operator to stop. He looked at Laura. She looked at me and raised the megaphone. "This vehicle is parked in violation of the fire lane proximity rule," she said through the speaker. "It is within 15 feet of a hydrant and must be relocated. I have authorized the tow under HOA enforcement protocol." I looked at the curb. There was a fire hydrant halfway down the block, at least 40 feet away. I told her that. She shook her head and pointed at a faded yellow mark on the curb near the hydrant. She said the 15-foot rule applied to the mark zone, not the hydrant itself. I asked her to show me that rule in writing. She tapped her clipboard. "I do not care what you think, I care what the rule says," she said. "The rule is in the amended bylaws distributed last quarter. If you did not read them, that is your problem. The tow is proceeding." I asked the tow operator if he had authorization paperwork. He looked uncomfortable. He said Laura had called him and told him it was an HOA-authorized tow. I asked if he had seen any signed work order or proof that the vehicle was actually in violation. He hesitated. Laura stepped between us and raised the megaphone again. "I am the pool and amenities chair, and I am authorized to enforce compliance," she said. "This is an emergency safety tow, and you are interfering with HOA business. If you do not step back, I will call the police." My brother came outside in his pajamas. He asked what was happening. I told him Laura was trying to tow his rental because she had invented a new rule overnight. He looked at the hydrant, then at Laura, then at me. He said he had to catch a flight in 3 hours, and if his car got towed, he would miss it. That was the time pressure. That was the moment I realized this was not about parking. This was about control. Laura wanted to prove she could tow anyone, anytime, for any reason, and no one would stop her. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the tow truck, the rental car, the hydrant, and the curb. I told the tow operator I was documenting everything, and that if he proceeded without proper authorization, I would file a complaint with the city and the state consumer protection office. He looked at Laura again. She glared at me and lowered the megaphone. "Fine," she said. "I will let it go this time. But you are on notice. The next violation will result in an immediate tow and a fine, and I suggest you stop questioning my authority, because I can put you on the agenda and keep you there." She walked away. The tow operator unhooked the chains and drove off. My brother moved his car to a different spot 2 blocks away, and I drove him to the airport 3 hours later. On the way, he asked me why I did not just move out. I told him I was trying to refinance, and any lien or legal action from the HOA could wreck the deal. He said it sounded like I was living in a parking enforcement police state. He was right. The Monday after my brother left, I went to the management office. It was a small storefront in a strip mall 2 miles from the neighborhood. There was one employee behind the desk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who introduced herself as the property manager. I asked her about the guest parking decal rule. She sighed and pulled up a file on her computer. She said the rule had been proposed by Laura Hayes 2 months ago and approved by the board in a closed session. She said it was supposed to reduce overcrowding in the guest lot, but in practice, it just generated complaints. I asked her how many decals had been issued. She said 4. I asked her how many units were in the neighborhood. She said 230. I asked if there was any record of the fire lane proximity rule Laura had cited. The property manager frowned and clicked through several screens. She said there was no fire lane proximity rule in the current bylaws. She said the only fire lane rule was the standard one that prohibited parking in marked fire lanes, and those were clearly painted red. I asked her if Laura had the authority to authorize tows. She hesitated, then said that board members could request tows for vehicles in clear violation, but that the management company was supposed to verify the violation before dispatching a tow truck. I asked if she had verified the violation for my brother's rental. She said no. She said Laura had called the tow company directly. That was when I realized Laura was operating outside the system. She was not enforcing HOA rules. She was inventing rules, calling tow trucks on her own authority, and using her position to intimidate residents. I asked the property manager if I could file a formal complaint. She said I could, but that it would go to the board, and Laura was on the board. I asked if there was anyone above the board. She said the only recourse was to vote out board members during the annual election or file a lawsuit. The election was 10 months away. I could not wait 10 months. I needed to refinance in 6 weeks or my rate lock would expire. I left the office and sat in my car. I opened the Towline Oaks Reserve Association neighborhood portal on my phone. It was a private Facebook group with 500 members, most of whom posted photos of suspicious cars and accused each other of violations. I scrolled through 2 weeks of posts. There were at least a dozen complaints about Laura Hayes. One resident said she had been towed from her own driveway because Laura claimed the vehicle was not registered with the HOA. Another said Laura had placed an orange cone in his guest spot and told him it was reserved for emergency access. A third said Laura had threatened to revoke his pool key because his lawn was too long, even though the lawn maintenance rule was enforced by a different committee. Every complaint ended the same way. No resolution, no accountability. Just Laura telling people she did not care what they thought, she cared what the rules said. I started taking notes. I documented every post, every complaint, every instance of selective enforcement. I saved screenshots. I created a folder on my phone labeled HOA evidence. I did not know what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew I needed proof. I also knew I needed help. I reached out to a neighbor named Tom, who sat on the Architectural Review Committee. He was not friends with Laura, and he had been vocal in the past about board overreach. I messaged him privately and asked if he would be willing to talk. He said yes. We met at a coffee shop the next afternoon. Tom was in his 60s, retired, and deeply frustrated with the HOA. He told me Laura had been a problem for 2 years. He said she had been elected to the board by running on a platform of increased security and property value protection. But once she got the pool and amenities chair position, she turned it into a personal enforcement empire. He said she had pushed through the guest parking decal rule without input from the other committees, and she had convinced the board president that strict enforcement would reduce liability. I asked him if the board president knew Laura was calling tow companies directly. He said probably not. He said Laura was good at operating in the gaps, making decisions that looked legitimate on the surface but were not actually authorized. I asked Tom if he would be willing to speak up at the next board meeting. He said he would, but he warned me that Laura had a habit of shutting down criticism by citing rules no one else had read. He said the best strategy was to come prepared with documentation and to make her commit to her version of the rules in public. He said if I could get her to say something definitively wrong on the record, the board would have no choice but to address it. That was when I remembered the body camera. Laura had been wearing it during both confrontations. If she was recording, then so was I. I had photos and timestamps. But more importantly, I had a plan. The next escalation came on Wednesday. I came home from work and found a notice on my door. It was printed on the same yellow paper as the guest parking notice, but this time it was addressed specifically to my unit. It announced that the HOA had scheduled a safety inspection of my exterior utility connections and that a vendor would be accessing my property the following morning between 8 and noon. There was no request for permission. There was no explanation of what utility connections needed inspection. There was no contact number, just a notice that someone would be altering something on my property under the excuse of safety. I called the management office. The property manager said she had no record of any scheduled safety inspection. She said the notice was not printed on official HOA letterhead. She said it looked like something Laura had created independently. I asked her if Laura had the authority to send vendors onto my property. She said no. She said any maintenance work had to be approved by the board and coordinated through the management company. I asked her what I should do if the vendor showed up. She said I should refuse entry and document everything. I said I would. The next morning, I stayed home from work. At 8:30, a white panel van pulled up in front of my unit. Two men got out, both wearing unmarked uniforms. One of them knocked on my door. I opened it and asked what they were here to inspect. He said he had been hired to check the gas meter and the water shutoff valve for code compliance. I asked who hired him. He said the HOA. I asked for a work order. He pulled out a printed email on his phone. It was from Laura Hayes, sent from her personal email address, with the subject line Safety Inspection Authorization. The email instructed the vendor to inspect all ground floor utility connections at my unit and to document any issues. It did not mention the management company. It did not mention board approval. It was just Laura, acting alone. I told the vendor I did not authorize the work and that the HOA did not have permission to send anyone onto my property without advance coordination through the management company. He looked confused. He said he had been paid up front and he needed to complete the inspection or he would lose the contract. I asked him how much he had been paid. He said $200. I asked him if he had any official HOA paperwork, like a board resolution or a signed contract. He said no. He said Laura had called him directly and told him it was urgent. I told him I was sorry, but he was not getting onto my property. He shrugged and got back in his van. As he drove away, I saw Laura standing near the mailboxes, watching. She had her body camera on and her coffee cup in her hand, shaking slightly. I walked over to her. I asked her why she had sent a vendor to my property without authorization. She raised her coffee cup and took a sip, then smiled. I did not send anyone, she said. I coordinated a safety inspection on behalf of the HOA. It is my responsibility as pool and amenities chair to ensure compliance with safety standards. You refused entry, which is a violation of the cooperative access clause in the bylaws. I will be filing a report with the board. I asked her what cooperative access clause. She pulled out her laminated card again and pointed to a line of text. I leaned in and read it. It said homeowners must provide reasonable access for emergency repairs and inspections. I told her that clause applied to emergencies, not routine inspections, and that it required advance notice and management coordination. She shook her head. I do not care what you think. I care what the rule says, she said. You are in violation. I will be recommending a fine at the next board meeting. And if you continue to interfere with HOA business, I can put you on the agenda and keep you there. I did not respond. I took out my phone and recorded the conversation. She saw the phone and frowned. I said I was documenting her claim that she had the authority to send vendors onto my property without management approval. I said I would be filing a complaint with the board and requesting a review of her actions. She laughed. Good luck with that, she said. I have been on this board for 2 years and no one has ever successfully challenged me. I have documentation for everything I do. I follow the rules. You are the one breaking them. She walked away. I stood there holding my phone, replaying the recording in my head. She had just admitted on camera that she had sent the vendor on her own authority. She had claimed it was her responsibility as pool and amenities chair, even though that position had no jurisdiction over utility inspections. She had threatened me with fines and board agendas. And she had done it all while wearing a body camera that was recording the same conversation from her perspective. That was when I realized the body camera was not just a prop. It was evidence. If I could get access to that footage, I could prove she was operating outside her authority and targeting me specifically. But I did not need her footage. I had my own. I had photos, timestamps, recordings, and witnesses. I had Tom, who was willing to testify that Laura had a pattern of overreach. I had the property manager, who had confirmed that Laura was acting without management approval. I had the vendor who had admitted he was hired directly by Laura. And I had the neighborhood portal, where dozens of residents had posted similar complaints. I just needed to put it all together in a way that the board could not ignore. I spent the next 3 days building a packet. I printed every screenshot. I transcribed every recording. I attached photos of the chalk mark, the tow truck, the notice, and the vendor van. I included a timeline showing how Laura had escalated from verbal warnings to towing threats to unauthorized property access in less than a week. I labeled it Evidence of Selective Enforcement and Board Member Overreach. I made 5 copies. The next board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. I submitted a request to speak during the homeowner comment period. The property manager confirmed my slot. I told Tom I was planning to present the evidence packet and asked the board to investigate Laura's actions. He said it was a good plan, but he warned me that Laura would fight back. He said she would try to reframe the issue as a personal attack and use procedural rules to shut me down. He said I needed to stay calm, stick to the facts, and force her to answer specific questions. I said I would. The night before the meeting, I got an email from the board president. It said my comment period request had been reviewed and that the board had decided to limit my speaking time to 3 minutes due to a full agenda. It said I could submit written comments if I needed more time. I replied and said 3 minutes was not enough to present a detailed evidence packet. The board president replied and said the time limit was non-negotiable. I forwarded the email to Tom. He said it was a classic board tactic to prevent criticism. He said I should bring the packets anyway and distribute them to the board members before the meeting started. He said even if I only got 3 minutes to speak, the board would have the documentation in front of them and they would be forced to address it. The meeting was held in the clubhouse at 7 in the evening. There were about 30 residents in attendance, most of whom looked annoyed or exhausted. The board sat at a folding table at the front of the room. Laura was on the far right, wearing her blue blazer and her body camera. The board president was a man in his 70s named Richard, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. I arrived 15 minutes early and handed out the evidence packets. Richard flipped through his copy and frowned. Laura did not open hers. She just stared at me. The meeting started with routine business, budget approvals, landscaping bids, pool maintenance schedules. It took 45 minutes. By the time the homeowner comment period started, half the residents had left. I was the only person who had signed up to speak. Richard called my name and reminded me I had 3 minutes. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I said I was here to present evidence of selective enforcement and unauthorized actions by a board member. Laura crossed her arms. I opened my copy of the packet and began reading the timeline. I got through the first 2 incidents before Richard interrupted me. He said I was over time and needed to wrap up. I said I had barely started. He said the board had reviewed my written submission and they would take it under advisement. I asked when they would respond. He said they would discuss it in executive session and provide a written response within 30 days. I asked if Laura would be recused from the discussion since she was the subject of the complaint. He hesitated. Laura leaned forward and spoke into her microphone. I have done nothing wrong, she said. Everything I do is authorized by the bylaws and the safety protocols established by this board. If this homeowner has a problem with enforcement, he should read the rules instead of wasting our time with personal grievances. I said it was not a personal grievance. I said I had documented multiple instances of Laura acting without management approval, inventing rules that did not exist, and threatening residents with towels and fines. I said I had witness statements and recordings. Laura smiled. Then submit them through the proper channels, she said. This is not the forum for unsubstantiated accusations. I do not care what you think. I care what the rule says. And the rule says homeowner complaints must be submitted in writing and reviewed in executive session. You are out of order. Richard nodded and said the meeting was moving on. I started to argue, but Tom stood up from the audience and asked to speak. Richard said the comment period was over. Tom said he was a committee chair and he had a procedural question. Richard sighed and said he had 1 minute. Tom asked if the board had reviewed the evidence packet I had distributed. Richard said they had glanced at it. Tom asked if they planned to investigate the claims. Richard said they would discuss it privately. Tom asked if there was a timeline for that discussion. Richard said no. Tom sat down. I looked at the board. None of them were making eye contact except Laura, who was staring at me with a smug expression. I realized the board was not going to do anything. They were going to file my complaint, ignore it for 30 days, and then send me a boilerplate response saying they had found no wrongdoing. Laura knew it. That was why she was smiling. I sat down and felt the frustration build in my chest. I had spent days building that packet. I had documented everything, and the board had dismissed it in 3 minutes. After the meeting, Tom pulled me aside in the parking lot. He said he was sorry the board had shut me down. He said Laura had too much influence, and the board president did not want to deal with conflict. He said the only way to force accountability was to go outside the HOA system. He said I should file a complaint with the management company's corporate office or contact an attorney. I said I could not afford an attorney, and I did not have time to wait for a corporate investigation. Tom nodded. He said there was one other option. He said if I could prove Laura had committed fraud or acted criminally, I could involve the police. I said I did not think what she was doing was criminal. Tom said it might be. He said calling a tow company without proper authorization could be considered false impersonation or theft of services. He said if the tow company was charging the HOA for unauthorized tows, that was fraud. I said I would look into it. If this sounds familiar, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA nightmares and the victories that come after. The next morning, I called the tow company Laura had used. I identified myself as a Towline Oaks resident and said I was trying to verify authorization records for a tow that had occurred the previous weekend. The dispatcher said she could not release that information without a subpoena. I said I was not asking for detailed records. I just wanted to confirm whether the tow had been authorized by the management company or by an individual board member. She put me on hold. When she came back, she said the authorization had come from Laura Hayes directly. She said Laura had called and provided her name and title, and that was sufficient for them to dispatch a truck. I asked if they verified board authorizations with the management company. She said no. She said they relied on the caller to be truthful. I thanked her and hung up. That confirmed it. Laura was calling tow companies and claiming authority she did not have. The tow company was not verifying the claims. If the tow had gone through, I would have been charged a tow fee, a storage fee, and possibly a fine from the HOA, all based on a lie. I called the management company and asked to speak to the corporate compliance officer. I was transferred twice and eventually got a voicemail. I left a detailed message explaining the situation and asking for an investigation. I did not expect a fast response, but I wanted it on the record. Then I did something I had been avoiding. I looked up HOA attorneys in Boston. I found a firm that specialized in homeowner disputes and booked a free consultation. The attorney's name was Michael. He was in his 40s, calm and methodical. I brought my evidence packet and explained the situation. He listened, took notes, and asked a lot of questions. At the end of the consultation, he said I had a strong case for harassment and selective enforcement. He said the unauthorized vendor access was particularly concerning because it could be considered trespassing or unlawful entry. He said if I wanted to pursue legal action, he could file a cease and desist letter and a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office. I asked how much it would cost. He said the letter would be $1,500 and the complaint would be another $1,000. I said I would think about it. I could not afford that, not while I was trying to refinance, but I did not tell Michael that. I just said I would be in touch. He gave me his card and said if the situation escalated, I should call him immediately. I left his office feeling more trapped than when I had arrived. Laura was escalating. The board was ignoring me. The management company was slow, and I could not afford a lawyer. I needed a different strategy. I needed something that would force the board to act without costing me thousands of dollars. That was when I remembered the trump card. I had been holding back one piece of evidence. During the second confrontation, when Laura had tried to have my brother's car towed from the street, she had said something very specific through her megaphone. She had said she was authorized to enforce compliance and that it was an emergency safety tow. But the pool and amenities chair did not have enforcement authority. That power belonged to the compliance committee, which was a separate entity. Laura had claimed authority she did not legally have, in clear terms in front of witnesses, and I had recorded it. I had not included that recording in the evidence packet because I wanted her to commit to her version of the story in public before I revealed it. If I played the recording too early, she would just claim she had misspoken or that I had edited the audio. But if I waited until she repeated the claim at a board meeting or in a formal hearing, I could use her own words to prove she was lying. I just needed to force her into a situation where she would repeat the claim. That was the hard part. I could not control when Laura would escalate again. I could not predict what rules she would invent next. But I could create a situation where she felt pressured to act. I decided to test the guest parking decal rule. I invited a friend to visit for the weekend and told him to park in the guest lot without a decal. I wanted to see if Laura would follow through on her towing threat. If she did, I would document it, record it, and use it as leverage. If she did not, I would know she was bluffing. My friend arrived on Friday evening. He parked in the guest lot and came inside. I watched from the window. 30 minutes later, Laura walked past the guest lot with her clipboard and her body camera. She stopped, took a photo of my friend's car and wrote something down. Then she walked to the clubhouse. I assumed she was calling the tow company. I told my friend to move his car immediately. He did. By the time Laura came back, the car was gone. She looked confused. She stood in the guest lot for a few minutes, scanning the area, then walked back to the clubhouse. I knew she was frustrated. That was exactly what I wanted. The next escalation came on Monday. I got a letter in the mail from the Towline Oaks Reserve Association Board of Directors. It was printed on official letterhead and signed by Richard, the board president. The letter informed me that the board had reviewed my complaint and found no evidence of wrongdoing by any board member. It said the guest parking decal rule and the fire lane proximity rule were valid and enforceable. It said my refusal to comply with safety inspections was a violation of the Cooperative Access Clause. It said I was being fined $300 for obstruction of HOA business. The fine was due in 30 days. If I did not pay, a lien would be placed on my property. I read the letter 3 times. It was insane. The board had not investigated anything. They had taken Laura's version of events at face value and used it to justify a fine. The fine itself was retaliatory. It was designed to punish me for filing a complaint. And the lien threat was real. If the lien went through, my refinance would be delayed or denied. I could not let that happen. I called Michael, the attorney. He said the fine was almost certainly unenforceable and that the lien threat was improper. He said I could fight it, but it would take time and money. He said the faster option was to pay the fine under protest and file a lawsuit later to recover it. I said I was not paying a bogus fine. He said then I needed to act fast. I asked him what I should do. He said I should request a formal hearing to contest the fine. He said HOA bylaws usually required the board to grant a hearing if requested in writing. He said I should use the hearing to present my evidence and force the board to address the recordings and the witness statements. He said if the board refused to overturn the fine, I could escalate to the state attorney general or file a civil suit. I said I would request the hearing. He said, good luck. I submitted the hearing request that afternoon. I sent it via certified mail to the management company and copied the board president. The request was 2 pages long and cited the relevant bylaw sections. It demanded a hearing within 14 days and requested that Laura Hayes be recused from the hearing due to conflict of interest. I also requested that the hearing be recorded and that I be allowed to present evidence and call witnesses. I did not expect the board to grant all of my requests, but I wanted them on the record. The board responded 5 days later. They scheduled the hearing for the following Thursday at 6 in the evening. They said the hearing would be conducted by the full board, including Laura Hayes, because recusal was not required under the bylaws. They said I would be allowed to present evidence, but that witness testimony would be limited to written statements submitted in advance. They said the hearing would not be recorded by the board, but that I could record it for my personal use. It was better than nothing. I spent the next week preparing. I printed additional copies of the evidence packet. I wrote a script outlining my key points. I asked Tom if he would submit a written statement. He agreed. I also reached out to the vendor who had been sent to my property and asked if he would provide a statement confirming that Laura had hired him directly. He hesitated, then agreed. He sent me an email describing the conversation and confirming that he had no contract with the management company. I added it to the packet. The hearing was held in the same clubhouse where the board meeting had taken place. The setup was the same. The board sat at the folding table. Laura was on the far right wearing her body camera. I sat alone at a small table facing them. There were no other residents in the room. Richard opened the hearing by reading the charges. Obstruction of HOA business. Refusal to comply with safety inspections. Interference with enforcement actions. He asked if I understood the charges. I said yes. He asked if I wanted to present evidence. I said yes. I stood up and distributed the updated evidence packet. I started with the timeline. I walked through each incident referring to the photos and transcripts. I highlighted the vendor's statement. I highlighted the tow company dispatcher's confirmation that Laura had called directly. I explained that Laura had acted without management approval and that her actions constituted harassment. Richard listened. The other board members flipped through the packet. Laura sat motionless. When I finished, Richard asked if I had anything else to add. I said yes. I said I had a recording that proved Laura had claimed enforcement authority she did not legally have. I pulled out my phone and played the clip. It was crystal clear. Laura's voice amplified by the megaphone, saying she was authorized to enforce compliance and that it was an emergency safety tow. I let it play twice. Then I stopped and asked the board to explain how the pool and amenities chair had enforcement authority. Richard looked uncomfortable. He turned to Laura and asked her to respond. Laura leaned forward and spoke calmly into her microphone. I was acting in my capacity as a board member, she said. All board members have the authority to address immediate safety concerns. The vehicle in question was parked in a fire lane proximity zone, which is a safety violation. I coordinated with the tow vendor to address the issue. That is within my authority. I interrupted her. I said the fire lane proximity rule did not exist. I said the property manager had confirmed there was no such rule in the bylaws. Laura shook her head. The property manager is mistaken, she said. The rule was added during a bylaw amendment last year. It is in the supplemental documents. If you did not receive a copy, that is not my fault. I asked her to produce the supplemental documents. She said she did not have them with her. I asked Richard if the board had a copy of the supplemental documents. He said he would check with the management company. I said I would wait. Laura frowned. Richard said the hearing would be continued and that the board would issue a decision once they had reviewed all the materials. I said that was fine. Laura looked angry. I sat down. The hearing ended 10 minutes later. I left the clubhouse and called Tom. He asked how it went. I said I had played the recording and Laura had lied. He said that was good. He said if the board had any integrity, they would investigate the supplemental documents claim and find out it was false. He said the problem was that the board did not want to admit one of their own had been lying for months. He said they would try to find a way to dismiss the fine without acknowledging wrongdoing. I said I would not accept that. He said I might not have a choice. 2 days later, I got a call from the property manager. She said the board had reviewed the hearing materials and that they were concerned about the discrepancies. She said Richard had asked her to verify whether the fire lane proximity rule existed. She said she had searched every bylaw document, every amendment, and every policy memo, and there was no such rule. She said she had informed Richard and that he was planning to call a special board meeting to discuss the issue. She said she could not tell me what the board would decide, but that it was a positive sign. I thanked her and hung up. The special meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. I was not invited, but Tom was. He texted me updates throughout the meeting. He said Richard had confronted Laura about the supplemental documents claim. He said Laura had insisted the rule existed and that the management company had lost the records. He said Richard had asked her to produce any copy of the rule from any source. She could not. Tom said the other board members started asking questions. One of them asked why Laura had been calling tow companies directly. Another asked why she had sent a vendor to my property without board approval. Laura got defensive. She said she was following procedures and that the board was undermining her authority. Tom said Richard asked her if she had the authority to authorize tows. She said yes. Tom said Richard asked her to cite the specific bylaw. She pulled out her laminated card and read from it. But the section she cited was about pool access, not enforcement. Tom said the room went silent. Then one of the board members, a woman named Susan, said she had been reviewing the complaint log and had found a pattern of similar issues. She said there were multiple complaints about unauthorized towing threats, invented rules, and harassment. She said Laura had been operating outside her authority for months, and the board had ignored it. Tom said Laura stood up and accused Susan of siding with troublemakers. Susan said she was siding with the bylaws. Tom said Richard called for a vote on whether to suspend the fine pending further investigation. The vote was 4-1. Laura was the only no. Tom said Laura stormed out of the meeting. Tom called me after the meeting ended. He said the fine had been suspended and that Richard had promised a full investigation. He said the board was finally taking the issue seriously. He said I should expect a formal apology and possibly a reversal of the fine. I said that was good, but I was not done. I said I wanted Laura removed from the board. Tom said that would be harder. He said the only way to remove a board member was a recall vote, which required a petition signed by 20% of the homeowners. I said I would start the petition. The investigation took 3 weeks. During that time, the board hired an outside attorney to review the evidence and interview witnesses. The attorney spoke to me, Tom, the property manager, the vendor, and several other residents who had filed complaints. He also reviewed the tow company records and the neighborhood portal posts. At the end of the investigation, he submitted a 20-page report to the board. Tom got a copy and forwarded it to me. The report confirmed everything I had documented. It said Laura had acted without authority, invented rules, harassed residents, and misrepresented her position to vendors and tow companies. It said her actions violated the bylaws and exposed the HOA to legal liability. It recommended that Laura be removed from the board and that the HOA issue a formal apology to all affected residents. It also recommended that the board implement new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse. The board met to discuss the report. This time, they invited me. The meeting was held on a Wednesday evening. Laura was not there. Richard opened the meeting by summarizing the report. He said the board took the findings seriously and that they were committed to restoring trust. He said the fine against me had been officially reversed and that the HOA would reimburse any costs I had incurred. He said the board was also voting to censure Laura Hayes and strip her of all committee responsibilities. He said Laura had been banned from contacting homeowners outside of official meetings. He said the board had offered Laura the option to resign, but she had refused. He said the next step would be a recall petition, which the board would support. I asked Richard if the board would hold Laura accountable for the financial impact of her actions. He said the HOA's insurance would cover any legal claims, but that Laura could be held personally liable if the HOA chose to pursue it. I asked if the board was planning to pursue it. He hesitated. Susan, the board member who had questioned Laura during the special meeting, spoke up. She said the board was discussing the option, but that it would require a vote. She said she supported holding Laura accountable. I said I would support a vote. Richard said the board would discuss it in executive session and let me know. I said that was fine. Richard asked if I had any other concerns. I said I wanted to make sure the HOA would stop the selective enforcement and the predatory towing. He said the board had already updated the guest parking policy to remove the decal requirement and clarify the rules. He said they had also terminated the contract with the tow company Laura had been using and hired a new vendor that required written authorization from the management company before dispatching any trucks. I said that was a good start. He said the board appreciated my patience and that they were committed to making things right. The meeting ended. Tom pulled me aside and congratulated me. He said I had done what no one else had been able to do. I said I just wanted to refinance my house and not get harassed. He laughed. He said the recall petition was already circulating and that it would probably hit the signature threshold within a week. He said Laura's reign was over. I said I hope so. The recall petition succeeded. 2 weeks later, the board held a special election. Laura was removed by a vote of 73%. She did not attend the meeting. The new pool and amenities chair was a retired teacher named Linda who promised to focus on actual amenities instead of enforcement. The board also voted to pursue a civil claim against Laura for the unauthorized vendor costs and the tow company fees. The claim was settled out of court for $12,000. Laura moved out of the neighborhood 3 months later. The last time I saw her was in the parking lot. I was carrying groceries to my car. She was loading boxes into a moving truck. She saw me and stopped. She did not say anything. She just stared. I nodded and kept walking. I did not gloat. I did not need to. She knew. The refinance went through. I got my rate lock and my loan closed on time. The HOA lien threat never materialized. The neighborhood portal calmed down. People stopped posting photos of cars and started posting photos of dogs. The new board implemented quarterly town halls and published the bylaws on the HOA website. The guest parking lot got repainted and the fire lane rules got clarified. Tom stayed on the architectural review committee and became the unofficial watchdog for board overreach. He texted me every time the board proposed a new rule, just to make sure it was legitimate. I learned a few things from the experience. I learned that HOA boards can be dangerous when they are not held accountable. I learned that documentation is everything. I learned that you can fight back without breaking the law. And I learned that sometimes the person screaming the loudest about the rules is the one breaking them. One final thing happened that made the whole ordeal worth it. About 6 months after Laura left, I got a call from the new board president. It was Linda, the retired teacher. She said the board had been reviewing old meeting minutes and they had found something interesting. She said during the special meeting where Laura had been confronted, Laura's body camera had been recording. She said the board had requested a copy of the footage from Laura as part of the investigation, and Laura had refused. She said the board had then subpoenaed the footage through their attorney. The footage showed Laura admitting in private conversations that she knew the fire lane proximity rule did not exist, and that she had invented it to target specific residents. It also showed her coaching the tow company dispatcher on what to say if anyone called to verify authorization. Linda said the board had turned the footage over to the district attorney's office. She said the DA was reviewing it for possible fraud charges. She said Laura had hired a criminal defense attorney. Linda said she wanted me to know because I had been the primary target and I might be called as a witness. I said I would cooperate. Linda thanked me and hung up. I never heard what happened with the DA investigation, but I did not need to. The fact that Laura's own body camera had recorded her lies was poetic justice. The tow yard window showdown never happened in the dramatic way I had imagined, but it did not need to. The real showdown had happened at the hearing, when I played the recording and forced Laura to defend a rule that did not exist. The real victory had happened when the board finally listened and held her accountable. And the real karma had happened when Laura's own recording played back her lies in a way she could not talk over. I still live in Towline Oaks. The neighborhood is better now. The HOA is functional. The rules make sense. And when I see a tow truck in the parking lot, I know it is there because someone actually violated a real rule, not because someone with a megaphone and a grudge decided to invent one. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate you being here.